What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Timeless Steel. I got an interesting one today. So you DeLorean owners out there, you know about frame rot, right? Well, this is frame rot. And what's funny is there's a lot of cars driving around with front frame extensions that look maybe not as bad as this, but pretty close. This might possibly be some of the worst welding I've ever seen. Somebody needs to put the stick welder down, but look at this. If I pull down on the sway bar, all the structure in the front end is completely floating. It is just unbelievably unsafe. So the guy that owns this car is smart enough to know that, and that's why it's here. I'm not doing a restoration on it. I'm just gonna make it safe. We got a brand new front frame extension right here. But I mean, there's a lot of cars that are driving around where these have been crunched and they're like, okay, it's fine. Well, that's what happened to this thing originally, and stress cracked, and that's probably why the previous guy tried to weld it. But your entire front suspension relies on this sway bar for 4.5 movement in the lower control arm. So without that sway bar, there's nothing keeping this wheel from doing that. Your steering rack is mounted to this. Your radiator and fans are mounted to this. The factory knew it was a problem and put these in, but they don't solve everything. So, I mean, your tire, everything. So anyhow, I'm gonna cut this out and weld a new one in. It's not that complicated. You can do it in the car, or you can take the body off if you're doing other things. Without a lift though, this is pretty hard to do. So all we're gonna do is we're gonna pull the tie rods, we're gonna unbolt the sway bar at each lower control arm, here and here. Take the steering rack mounts off, take the steering coupler off the rack, drain the coolant out of the radiator system, drop the radiator fan assembly out, disconnect the harness, take the horns off, disconnect the upper radiator mounts, and I believe that's everything. And then we're just gonna cut this thing off with Sawzall and some death wheels. So I'll keep you up to date. This isn't a get done in one day kind of project, but I figured it's something that some of you DeLorean owners out there might want to see. All right, sway bar is off, tie rods are off. Hey, pro tip on these tie rods, if you're a do-it-yourselfer like me, always leave the nut on the top of the tie rod once you get it loose, so that you can either use a big freaking hammer and beat the crap out of it and pop the tie rod out, and hopefully if you damage the nut, you got one laying around, but at least you didn't damage the threads on the tie rod. Or if you really want to save yourself time, just get you one of these cheap Harbor Freight ball joint presses, tie rod press. Most of the time if you use one of these, you can save the boot. And also, before you do any work on your suspension, get yourself a can of PB Blaster or whatever penetrant you like and soak everything down that you're going to mess with the night before. So I've got the rack loose. You got 2 bolts here, 2 bolts there. One thing I wanted to talk about for new owners, these studs on these rack bushing mounts, this is what's holding the rack into the car. You got one on each side. They're unique. They only fit where they're supposed to go. But most of the time these studs are rusty or rotten, or someone's over torqued them. They don't take much torque to strip them. So if you're putting this in, if you're putting a new steering rack in your car, which most DeLorean owners have to do, check that your brackets aren't over tightened or haven't been destroyed. In my opinion, I just order new brackets and bushings to save yourself the time, because you're likely going to have one that's messed up. And for me personally, I've got poly bushings on my car here. But once that's pretty much it. And then you got the rack right here, and this owner had a Borgenson style mount on that you're going to have to disconnect. But now this rack is just free floating in here. So I'll pop the rack out, then we're on to the radiator assembly, and then it's almost cutting time. And you can see what I was talking about here. This is his actual steering linkage connecting to the steering wheel. These joints are pretty nice upgrade. Okay, I'll be back. All right, I want you guys to see this. So there's the steering rack. I mean, the front frame extension. Now the steering rack's been removed and the sway bar's been removed, so any additional support tying this to the frame is gone. Look at this. It's garbage. There's no structure to the front of this car at all. Dangerous. All right, everything is out. Now you can see how bad this thing really is. There's literally nothing to this entire structure. And you can see, look at that. I just broke that with about 15 pounds of force. This was one bad bump away from being a really bad day to whoever last drove this thing before the previous owner, or the new owner, got it. But now's the fun part, cutting it out. All right, well, the fun part or the messy part or whatever is over. Good old-fashioned saw there. But yeah, this thing was pretty bad. There's a couple of spots here I'll probably reinforce, but the actual important parts are okay. But this thing is just junk. Pretty much ripped that thing out by hand, so we'll save another one. All right, well, there's the end of day one. I've got the frame mostly prepped. I'll come back through and clean this up some more before I weld, but that epoxy is just no fun. There's a couple spots here that need to be touched up, a couple little pinholes. But the owner wants to keep as much original metal as possible, so anyhow, I already test fit this guy up in there. Fits good. And what a mess. There's no way around it. It's a messy job. Look at me, I'm a mess. Maybe a mad scientist. All right, we'll pick up where we left off next time. See you. Well, here we are again, kids. Big man, Parliament. Another day, another dollar. Get back to work on this frame repair job. I'm gonna start back by continuing to prep the surface. I gotta remove the crossover hard line for the brakes, located right now, and get in there and clean some more of that epoxy off, and then start prepping that frame piece, throw some primer on it, hopefully have it welded in, at least tacked in today. Okay. All right, I got the frame cleaned up how I want it. Now you can see shiny metal. That's what you want to see before you weld on there. This epoxy is just nasty stuff. So you're going to go through a lot of 30-40 grit sandpaper discs to get that epoxy off. Once it heats up, it melts, and then it clogs up the sanding paper, and then the sander gets the epoxy hot and it spreads it all over the metal. So it is super pain to get off. But anyhow, you can see all the old welds, and I've actually ground the front surface of the entire frame here flat. And this is my technique. I did it on my personal car, and I'm doing it on this car as well. You end up with a really thin piece of the old frame. You can see there left on there, but this frame is so thin, and by the time you sand that down, it just gives you a little bit of extra metal to weld that new frame to, and it's not enough of a difference here to throw anything off once you put the frame on. There's two different ways you can do these uppers. You can weld them you can grind them completely off, or you can clean them up and weld to them. And then his frame's got a little buckling here from whatever he hit the front on, so I'm gonna just put some 1/8 plate on here, just to kind of reinforce that section, and then you won't see this plate once the new frame's on. So yeah, we're pretty much at the point now. You got to be careful. I disconnected this brake line while I was grinding, but you also don't want that brake fluid getting all in the metal that you're trying to weld on. So you got to clean it. I clean this whole thing with acetone just to wipe all the dust off, and then once I go to weld, I'll do the same thing again. But now we're at the point of unwrapping this new frame and test fitting it. Now my experience with these is that they fit pretty good. But they send them with like an extra inch of material on the top. So it's kind of, you just got to keep taking a little bit of material at a time until you get the thing up in there. And the way I like to do this is one of these little guys right here. If I can get my fingers on it. One of these digital angle gauges. Put the thing on, put it up on top here where it's sitting flat on the top of the frame, like that, and then reset your 0. Put that on your new frame until it's 0, and you're pretty close. And then as far as you know, keeping it centered on the frame, you're going to be able to tell where the old frame was. So just take your time, and then once you get it mocked up in there, throw a couple of spot welds on it, and then it's finished welding. Now, one thing my uncle and I learned the first time we did this is if you try to run a hot bead all the way across the seam, the epoxy on the frame starts to melt and pollute the weld. So I'm going to alternate welding just to try to keep the frame cool and to melt as little epoxy as possible. But for now, I'm going to try to get this thing test fit. Once I get it where I want it, then I'm going to go and throw a coat of zinc-based frame primer in there on where it's hard to get to, so that when I put the thing up in the car, it's easier to paint, if that makes sense. So stay tuned. All right, so there you go. Lots of little cutting. You can see little pieces of frame all over the place. Every one of these DeLorean frames is a little bit different because they're handmade, and every one of these reprop extensions is a little bit different because it's handmade. So they're all gonna, you know, they're not one size fits all, and they're gonna fit perfect. You can't have both, right? So you get the frame as close as you can. This one, because of the front end impact's got a little concave in the middle, so I have to build up the weld in a few spots. But you can see the gauge there is zeroed out. No, this is just sitting here. But that's basically what it's gonna look like. So now I'm gonna take this frame off and Scotch-Brite the whole thing, and I'm gonna put a coat of basically zinc primer on it, which is basically what rust encapsulator is. And then I'll spot weld this thing in here and commence to final welding it, and the hard part will be done. Now for me, well, I got you guys here and we're talking about paint. Everybody's got their own products that they like. I really like this stuff. It's Eastwood internal frame coating, green. I like green because I like Ninja Turtles. Plus it makes it easy to see where you got the coating and if it's easily coated. Now, conversely, I've heard a lot about this stuff for engine block paint, and a lot of people say this Rust-Oleum Rusty Metal Primer is just as good as that stuff, and it's a lot cheaper. And then for top coat, I have a can of this because the can is thicker than the spray paint, but Smoke Gray is the closest color you're gonna get to the DeLorean frame. Now it comes out a little bit brighter than this, one because this epoxy is super old, and two because the color's not quite there. You want to see on my personal car, this is what the color looks like after it's painted. It's definitely a lighter color, but it's pretty close. So I'm gonna paint, and then once I get that paint drying, you can see that spot in there that's got a little bit of concave rust pitting to it. I'm going to put a piece of 1/8 inch flat stock there to reinforce that. By the time I'm done with that, hopefully the paint's tacky and I can get this thing tacked in. Stay tuned. All right, well, I got the Miller out here and I put the reinforcement plate in I was telling you guys about, and you can see it is a super pain in the butt to weld. You know, it's easy to burn through. You can't really see how much corrosion's on the back side of this metal, so some of the metal's thinner than other spots. And you can see where it gets thin and it blows through super easily. And then on top of that, this metal, it's like that epoxy is in the pore of the metal. So once this metal gets hot, the epoxy kind of like seeps into the weld, super cools it, and then fouls it. So you can see how I did a whole bunch of spot welds. I find that's the easiest way to do this. If you try to do a bead, it's just going to start popping and crackling as soon as that epoxy gets hot. But I'm actually pretty happy with how that turned out for these frames and this epoxy. All I did was hit that with a wire brush real quick. I'll clean up some of this popcorn here that I had on both sides, but that at least puts some strength back in this section here. And then the new frame is going to go back and it'll cover each side. You can see my little center line mark right there. I'm going to let that frame dry a little bit longer. I've got some primer on it, and I have all the welding areas taped off, so I don't have to grind those areas clean. But it's coming right along. I'm actually pretty happy with it so far. Like I said, there's going to be some welder out there that's a pro. It's going to be like, oh my god, that looks like garbage. But these frames are really not easy to weld on, so I'm pretty happy with that. It's going to work out. And now I got to do the same thing here, there, here, up there. So got plenty of welding gas left. Alright, I've got this thing mocked up in here, and I've got it centered left and right where I want it. So what I'm going to do is throw a couple of spot welds on the bottom to keep it centered left and right, and then I'm going to bend it up and down once I got the gauge 0 on the top of the cross member and the top of the new frame 0 to that. I'll throw some spots on the upper portions to hold it where I want it, and then it's just the long game welding it. All right, well, the frame is on. What a pain in the butt. I tell you, if that's your first welding project, I would not do this. You can see, like, no matter what you do, the epoxy bleeds out of the frame and pops air bubbles in the welds. So it's a huge pain in the butt, and there's no way you're gonna make this look pretty. Some of the welds are just awful in here, but they're strong. It's just that epoxy just bleeds out and makes it a nightmare. But new frame is on. It turned out pretty good. Most of the welds that have a bunch of epoxy boogered into them are going to be hidden by the steering rack. I mean, it's strong. It just doesn't look like dimes or something you'd put in a welding magazine. But that epoxy is just some of the nastiest stuff I've ever seen. So, do a strength test real quick. 207 pound me. See if it breaks off. I'd say it's good to go. And we're back. Another day, another outfit. Anyhow, I'm pretty much done with this thing, at least the hard stuff that you guys are interested in watching in this video. I've got to clean up a couple of welds. That epoxy is just such a pain. to get nice clean welds on. And I got a few things left to repair, and then it's just painting it and putting a whole bunch of new parts on. This thing, he's got new, his whole radiator assembly here is pretty much shot. The radiator's good, but we got new upper mounts from DPI, I think. Rob Grady hooked them up with a original fan shroud, because this one's blown apart. I'll swap the fans over too. We got some new tie rods, new sway bar bushings, poly sway bar bushings on the front, which I highly recommend on these cars. But you guys all know how to do that if you're a DeLorean owner. If not, there's plenty of videos on that stuff. So it's in the interest of keeping the video somewhat short, because you guys complain when I make hour-long videos. That's it for this one. But I'll tell you what, this car 5 or 10 years ago probably would have been parted out. And the market now is so crazy that you're seeing cars that were maybe not good restoration candidates 5 years ago being bought and restored, and I love that. I'm all about bringing cars back from the dead. I've restored this car like 3 times with the help of all kinds of different people, and that's exactly what this thing was. It was a dead car. When I bought this car originally, DMC Talk people were like, oh my God, you should part that out. You're gonna have so much money into it. Well, guess what? Welcome to classic cars. Whether you buy one or you build one, it's gonna cost you money. So I like stories. I like that was an awesome family I got that car from. That car would never be on the road again if it wasn't for me. It probably would have been parted out. And so I love seeing cars like this brought back to life. And it's going to leave here a lot safer than when it came in. And the owner's going to keep bringing it back to life. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed that video. I know it's been a little while. I've been a pretty busy guy. I think it's been a month since my last video. So I'll try to get some more content coming your way. This one's been tough. It's got a lot of work in this thing. But do me a favor. I know there's like 75% of the people watching these videos aren't subscribed. It really would help me out. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and I'll see you next time. Jimmy, Timeless Steel.